suddenly there's this track where she's sort of singing, or more so doing like a spoken word, almost beat poetry over the music. It just kind of blew my mind from a perspective of, I would think it was probably the inspiration of the name of the album. It was, I'm sure, intended for the album, but then there's just sort of the mystery of why was it left off? And was it because, she sounds a little bit more, I guess, masculine? Was it that she thought it would out her? Was it that the label didn't want it that way? Like, what was it? Because it's a really wonderful and powerful song.
Hello, welcome back to another episode of That Can't Be Right, a podcast about exploring structural wrongs, cultural oddities, and wild opinions. I am your host, Ryan Rogan. As always, follow along at TCBRPod on whatever social media, but mainly TikTok, Instagram, and Substack for the latest and greatest of That Can't Be Right. As a reminder, this show is a no-budget labor of love. If you're so inclined, please slide some pocket change my way at TCBRPod on Venmo. And if a donation isn't in the budget, I get it, inflation is crazy. Please rate, review, subscribe on your favorite podcast app. A few months ago, I was walking through a record store and was struck by some album artwork belonging to Howard Youngblood Bomar. Had never heard the name, picked up the album. It's fantastic, and I wanted to learn more about Howard, and I did. Ultimately, his story is a timeless tale of a super talented man who didn't rise to the spotlight, but in learning about Howard, I met my guest today, Jay Millar of Sundazed. Jay, welcome to That Can't Be Right.
Oh, it's good to be here. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm really excited. You teed up a story, and I kind of want to jump into that first, but I won't. Before we get to the other two records that got us here today, I would love to learn about your relationship to music as a fan, if you are musically inclined, and now at Sundazed. So I guess we can start with, as a fan, what was your relationship to music growing up?
Well, I dabbled a little bit in, trying to learn music, but ultimately I was never really a musician. I could never stick with anything. So I basically did my best to turn fandom into a career. Outside from, the first couple of part-time jobs as a young kid, every job I've had has been in music, be it from, working in a record store that led me to working for a major label company that led me ultimately to the company BMG moving me to New York. And then there was a record pressing plant that moved me to Nashville. And then sort of now Sundazed, even though I was working for Sundazed there, it was my initiation, but ultimately it was, we moved the office here to Hillsborough, North Carolina. And, but yeah, my whole life being a 47-year-old guy, I've got about 30 years in music already.
I'm glad you found it and stuck with it. I started my career in music and I've since left for reasons we don't need to get into. I'll save that for conversations with my therapist, but I'm glad you found music. You've stuck with it. You've been able to turn like your fandom and passion into a career. Can we do a quick game of like first or favorites?
Sure.
First record that you remember buying with your hard-earned money?
Oddly, I don't remember very well that one, but the big ones I remember, for some reason, I had a 45 of, and I can't believe, for the longest time I thought it was someone else, the artist, but I had a Barbra Streisand 45 with a song, Kiss Me in the Rain. And I remember that I think my parents loved it because I thought she was saying, kiss me in the leg. And I thought it was the funniest thing ever. And so I remember getting that. And then really, like, I think when music really started clicking for me was more so the Christmas I got a Walkman, and with it was a Weird Al Yankovic cassette. That would be more pivotal to everything. But I think I was one of the few who had a pretty good childhood. And I think it took a while until I used my own money for music. It kind of just felt like it was, if I really wanted something, I could usually coax my parents into buying it for me.
I get it. What about concerts? Are you a big live music fan?
I am. And similarly, this time I'll answer it, but I'll give you two answers. So my parents took me to, my first concert was to see Aerosmith, and my dad had gotten tickets free from work. And my brother, who's not a music fan at all, it's just strange. Although, like everyone, he claims to be. There's that sort of difference. The people who say, I love all kinds of music, and then you play something for them, they're like, whoa, no, I didn't know that stuff existed. The seats they got were like, I don't know, 10th row floor or something like that. We were really young. I talked to my mom about it recently. They ended up going, there was no eBay at the time or whatever. I don't know how they got them, but they hunted down tickets where they could sit somewhere else and at least be able to see my brother and I from there. So we're like, I don't know, at the best, maybe 13 or something, and getting contact high from a Aerosmith show. That was the first, but then the first I ever drove myself to was really bad hair metal. Like I was like the Monster Ballad guy, and it was the band Firehouse. A friend of mine did once accidentally buy a Fire Hose record, which turned into a humorous situation too. But Firehouse opening for the band Extreme, like More Than Words, like embarrassing bad. But yes, it was a lot of bad rock.
Not everything doesn't age well, but we enjoy it when we can. Going back to your brother, I always find it interesting when people like don't have strong opinions about music. It's, what do you mean? It's the soundtrack to everything. Like if you're walking around, you're at the grocery store, in movies, what are you doing in your car? Like, is it all talk radio? But hey, to each their own, I suppose. And in terms of collecting, like I see the artwork behind you, love it. But in terms of collecting records or collecting music, when did that start for you? Like as a more intentional hobby? And then we can pivot to the story you teed up before.
I think it took quite a while for me to even realize it was a hobby. It was just sort of instinctual to me. I guess I'd just kind of always been that way, whether it was Star Wars action figures as a kid or whatever it was. Once I got a taste of something, I kind of wanted as much of it as I could get. So I remember the closest thing I can remember of thinking about a collection would be buying those wall units for cassettes that were actually really hard if you wanted to alphabetize things, because you had to pull one out and then put it back in, pull one out, put it back in, because they had dividers next to each cassette. So remember either getting those things or getting the big CD cases, and they just kind of never went from there. I mean, once I got to CDs, it just kind of got to where I had to build my own CD cases into the walls. And when I first moved to New York and had a studio apartment, I had a divider wall that was just made of homemade CD cases. And then, yeah, there was the time, probably early 2000s, that I kind of got back to vinyl. Basically, around the time I got my first iPod, I started getting into vinyl. As it started as a justification of keeping my CDs, and it was just kind of looking at them and going like, well, I do like, I guess as you said, the collector aspect of it, and I like having the artwork and something tangible, liner notes. And then it was like, well, wait a minute, like, why don't I just get back into vinyl? And at the time, it was a lot cheaper than getting CDs, so that kind of kicked it back in. And now I've even started buying old open reel tapes, which are surprisingly amazing if you find the right ones, but big reel-to-reel tapes.
I'm just realizing that younger members of my audience are completely lost in the sauce with all the technology you just mentioned.
Yeah.
Even iPods, right? Those have gone at a very short life cycle compared to all the other technology, adoption, peak, and then just make it into something else. Reel-to-reel, vinyl. One last question. As a consumer, what are your thoughts on the resurgence of vinyl? Like, I would say amateur collector. Like, I'll go, if I see a record I know and like, I would pick it up. But now it's not prohibitively expensive, but it's way more expensive than it was even a decade ago. As a consumer, like, how does that make you feel?
It's an odd situation because, in some ways things are great in a sense that, like when I first started collecting, there was a lot of things, like most things, when someone does a format switch or something, or gets into something, or even if, like, to put it in a modern perspective, like maybe you switched from Spotify to Tidal or something, and the first thing you're doing is kind of reacquiring all the stuff that you had before. And when I first started doing that with vinyl, there was a lot of holes that either I wasn't going to fill because it never came out on vinyl, or stuff that was just so rare I wasn't willing to spend that sort of money on it. And now everything is available again, and almost too much is available. I do feel a little bad for the record stores because, like, when early on in us doing business, there was it was common for stores to bring in everything we put out. It was just like a standard, like, oh, it's Sundazed, they're reputable, of course, just whatever. If it's, bring in one of everything. If it's good, bring in two, or whatever. And now stores are really having to pick and choose because right now everybody is sort of reissuing anything that ever existed on vinyl, and anyone who was ever in a band decided that they should have their stuff out on vinyl. And it's great in a way, but yeah, it's gotten tough. And the cost thing is just sort of a weird reality of it, I think. Because, when you boil down to it, it's, it's always going to mirror sort of the price of gasoline, if you will. And if you think about how much gasoline has gone up in that time by percentage, vinyl hasn't really gone up that much. They're both petroleum-based products,
That's a good point. And an interesting consideration about like inventory and shelf space at record stores that I hadn't even considered. So, but let's talk about your experience with vinyl in your kitchen.
Yeah, that I spent close to 10 years working at United Record Pressing, a vinyl pressing plant in Nashville. We just had one incident where Wayne Coyne from the Flaming Lips had reached out to the plant, and I was the marketing guy who they brought me in because I had label connections, and I was basically doing outreach, and at that point in time, oddly enough, trying to convince artists that they should be putting their stuff out on vinyl. So Wayne decided that he was going to do his new record at the time filled with blood. And it was somewhat in a reaction to Jack White had done one that was liquid filled and filled with like a just blue liquid. And since he knew that that was made at our plant, he wanted us to do it. And the owner of the company passed him off to me to deal with. And I started preparing it and going like, okay, yeah, we're going to do this. And the owner ended up saying, no, there's no way we're going to do that in the plant. I was like, well, you agreed to this. He's like, I thought he was joking when he said he wanted blood in the records. And so in talking to Wayne, he's like, I still want to do this in Nashville. I'm going to be there. And I was like, well, I mean, there are other places, there are, some local record stores you could do. There are some, and just started listing all these options. And he's like, what about your house? And I'm like, yeah, sure. In that process, I got one of the best texts I've ever received in my life, which was, from Wayne and said, Jay, what's your address? Edward Sharpe and the Magnetic Zeros are FedExing their blood to your house, which was a real thing, and which actually is illegal too, as it turns out. But they did. And before I go into the details, one of the best quotes that came from the situation was Wayne dealing with the stuff and going, wow, even Chris Martin's blood has cheese in it. It was this weird, so like the reality of the situation, from the plant's perspective, what they did was create kind of do-it-yourself kits that would allow him to accomplish his mission of these, like basically giving him the components to attach two halves of a record together, which is not at all how records are made, with a little pocket where he could, it fits pretty well graphically in this instance, fill the records with a syringe. So he showed up with coolers filled with blood, like professionally taken, like in the little bags, like you'd see at the hospital and such. And, anyone from, Chris Martin to Yoko Ono to, I think Miley Cyrus, like there was just a wide variety of people's blood. And he got one of our kitchen bowls and put it on the table and just started pouring them all into the bowl and mixing them together, which is when, of course, some of it was kind of, not to, it's graphic for some people, I apologize, but some of it was coagulating, which is where sort of the cheese reference came in on Chris Martin's blood. But yeah, he went ahead and assembled those. And then he ended up having a little trouble, I think, trying to sell them initially, and I think his lawyer stepped in or something. They ended up selling them in like encased in glass, sort of, and sealed. So they were more like sold as almost like wall hangings, just because they were too scared that it was going to get toxic and somehow, I don't know. I mean, there's just obviously a lot that could go wrong there. But it's a unique story, I think, that not many people have.
I would imagine, but I'm also thinking they're friends for sure. But I'm just thinking, if I were to ask my friends, hey, I'm releasing a special podcast episode, series of podcast episodes, I need your blood, how that conversation would go.
Yeah.
But hey, love that it was a DIY situation. Unfortunate it had to be in your kitchen, but
well, we've since moved. Unrelated, though.
Unrelated. I'm sure that wasn't in the Zillow listing. This was not a blood donor center, just like a blood record manufacturing stop. Anyway, very cool. Very cool. Let's kind of jump to the artist that brought us here today. We can start with Jessica Williams, jazz pianist, born in Baltimore. Terrific album. By the time this episode comes out, the album will be available. But can you tell us a little bit more about Jessica?
Yeah. It was an interesting thing that there's a lot of, with what I do, there's a lot of stuff that when we acquire, with what we do as an archival music label, we do a lot of acquisition of catalogs, and we often say some of the best things we get or the best things we find are while we're looking for something else. To oversimplify it, we acquired this catalog of the small label called Clean Cuts. And, to be honest, it was largely because they had some good Dr. John records, and we casually looked into the other things and we're like, okay, there were other good things here too, but even if it were just the Dr. John, we'd be buying it. It was that sort of thing. We just started looking into things about Jessica and Jessica Williams, and it was, fascinating music, and she was highly revered. She had recently passed. She passed in 2022. There was an NPR interview with her. There was all kinds of, information about her and how talented she is. She recorded, umpteen records for a bunch of different labels. And that was sort of it. It was like, okay, it's a cool record and she's got some credibility. That's great. And then I meet the original owner of the label and we go to dinner and we're just sort of talking about things and talking about the catalog. He sort of casually brings up the fact that Jessica was born a man. It kind of blew my mind just because in this day and age, it's just hard to imagine anything being kept secret, like, whether you want to or not. And, also, I think as a culture, we're all trying our best to encourage people to feel comfortable being themselves and be open about who they are. And I realized that in the conversations with him that she was obviously very secretive about her life. I still don't know if, I forget the woman on NPR, but one of the big ones on NPR, I don't recall, I don't know if she had no idea or if she was just being respectful or, same with any of the articles and things that were out there. But, we decided that we wanted to tell the story, if you will, but it was such a delicate thing. We're like, well, we're not going to have a marketing sticker that says it. And we're not going to, how do we do this? And can we do this? Should we do this? And we ended up discovering that, she was married when she passed. And, we did contact her widower, who's a wonderful guy. And we got along with him well. And he helped kind of guide us through kind of telling her whole story without trying to come off, exploitative in any way. And, try to use that, rely on other people's guidance as, I'm certainly not going to be the best judge on that as, white, straight guy. I'm not going to speak very well or going to know, anything about the things that she had to go through. We also recruited a woman by the name of Jennifer Leatham, who's a jazz musician as well, a jazz bass player, currently active. And she comes from a similar background as Jessica. And she, conversely to Jessica, is very open about being transgender. So we got her to sort of write a little introduction to the record as well. But in talking to her widower, it was really heartbreaking to, at first he was really nervous about, us kind of telling her story. And it turned out that he was more worried for us. He was worried for me. He's like, you should know that Jessica and I had to move it was 10 times in 8 years or something like that, just because we kind of kept getting run out of town by, just horrible people. I don't know exactly what all they were doing, but they were basically being harassed until they'd move away. And so, I think that just led her to, keep her life a secret. It's just another fascinating chapter to, and another interesting thing with it. So one of the records that we acquired as part of that catalog is one of hers by the name of Orgonomic Music, which is a bit more out there in terms of her catalog. It's one of the more respected ones. And I got the masters, and we're going through the master tapes, the original recordings. All of the outtakes were on there too. I was kind of blown away that, she's made this career again, exactly umpteen records. All of them were instrumental piano, jazz. And suddenly there's this track where she's sort of singing, or more so doing like a spoken word, almost beat poetry over the music. And the song is called Organ, and the album's Organomic Music. And it just kind of blew my mind from a perspective of, I would think it was probably, the inspiration of the name of the album. It was, I'm sure, intended for the album, but then there's just sort of the mystery of why was it left off, and was it because, she sounds a little bit more, I guess, masculine was it that she thought it would out her? Was it that the label didn't want it that way? Like, what was it? Because it's a really wonderful and powerful song, but it kind of blew my mind. So it's like I feel like there's a lot of mystery that we're kind of bringing out, because I think in a lot of ways, we're now telling people's story of, a missing part of her background, along with kind of letting them hear her voice, which is, I don't know. To me, it's kind of special.
Agreed. Very much agreed. A fascinating story. I'd want to jump back to something you said earlier about your conversations with her husband, because when we connected via email, I had concerns about, like, how do you treat this subject, like, with the sensitivity and the respect it deserves without exploiting the situation. So could you share a little bit more about how he helped your storytelling, guided your storytelling as you were thinking about revealing this part of her life?
Thankfully, I think I had just sort of earned his trust after a while. I can gab for a bit, and I think I was just being very forthright with how I felt about it. And once he expressed some of the hardships that they had gone through and such, I think he was actually pretty upfront. It just took a while of conversation, but and I had insisted from the get-go that anything that we would do, we would first seek his blessing. Thankfully, he believed me, and it was true. And he was actually, from then on, very easy to deal with. But I think it's because we were very aware of the sensitivity of what we were doing and consciously trying to walk that delicate line. With anything that we do, it seems so many of them come with stories. We love when something can have such a powerful thing. But yeah, it is such a delicate line where it's like, well, this is such a wonderful, powerful story. On one hand, we want to scream it from the mountaintops. On the other hand, we're like, no, we want the music to speak for itself. And it's like, how do we do both of these? And I guess the answer is we don't know, but we're trying, and we're working with the right people to hopefully keep us in check.
No, I love that. And then to speak to this album specifically, is it maybe what attracted you to this album? And then how did you think about combing through and listening to some of the unreleased tracks?
The album, I just, as a music listener, I think over years and years of, diehard listening, like I often think that the difference between, the casual music fan and the diehard music fan is one lets the music come to them and the other seeks music and actively, chases like a drug, chases something they hadn't heard before, something new and unique, something strange, something that's just going to blow their mind. And, this record, partly just even seeing, the cover art, and the name, Organomic Music was strange, and everything about it. I have a tendency to just really love the strange these days. And it was just kind of her most out there record. So it immediately sort of spoke to me on a lot of levels, from the artwork to the confirmation when I put it on and listened. But then I just a lot of what I do in the day-to-day is just going through tapes and finding things, and it's a really special thing and a wonderful thing and very rewarding thing, and sometimes a very painful thing, because sometimes you find something amazing and you have no idea who it is. Or, I've had a great song I found on an album. I won't mention the artist, but fairly well-known artist. And I went back and said, oh, and we found this unissued track. It's amazing. And sent her a link to it. And she's like, yeah, that's not me. And I'm just thinking like, well, it sounds a lot like you. It's on the master tapes that you recorded in your session. One of your songs was recorded before it. One of your songs was recorded after it. But okay,
Oh yeah, I guess Ghost slid into the studio between takes.
So apparently, because it was, again, me, I think in addition to liking the weird, I like... and these don't represent it in any way, but I like rougher music, rawer music. Like I don't need things to be overly polished or and I think it was just a pretty loose recording, and I think there was maybe something about, her vocal delivery, like just one of those little things that, artists only hear in themselves, like when you see your friend's band and you're like, oh my God, you guys were amazing, and they're like, oh, we were so horrible today. But, just that self-critical thing, I think she just couldn't deal with it. And that's one of those similar things where it's like, oh, I feel like there's maybe an ethical dilemma in my future. Like, what if deep in the future when she's gone, do we could we put this out? Or do we just got to sit on this for eternity, which for now is what we're planning to do. But
I'm sure you're making the right decisions. Like you said, you're doing the best you can. But it's tough, right? Like if it wasn't out there, did they not want it out there? To your point, you asked the same questions. Did someone else in charge not want it out there? So kudos to you and Sundazed. And that brings me to kind of a hard segue. Can you tell us a little bit more about Sundazed? Like you've mentioned it throughout the conversation about Jessica acquiring the catalog, primarily for another artist, but discovering this. How does Sundazed operate? How are you evaluating content and deciding what to release?
I mean, going all the way back, the company was started in 1989 by a good friend of mine, Bob Irwin, and his wife, upstate New York. Over time, I became friends with him, and eventually it led to him bringing me on. And he's since retired and basically stepped away from the company, and I'm running things in the day-to-day now. And initially, he was working for Sony and had access to a lot of things, and also doing some work for a label called Rhino that does a lot of reissues of older stuff too. And it was around the time that Rhino was handling the Monkees catalog, which at the time was the time that MTV was putting reruns of the Monkees on television. So a whole new generation that I think included myself. That's probably how I discovered the Monkees as a kid, even though I'm much older than, when they were, or much younger rather than when they were current. Rhino was just so successful at the time, but they had access to so many great recordings that Bob wanted some of these things to come out and wished they'd come out. And they ultimately just said to him, like, well, why don't you just take them and go, we'll license them to you, and you just kind of go and put them out. And, you can take these smaller things that more or less we don't have time for. And it kind of spun out of that. I at one point was running a small label called Microfiche Records. It was my little boutique label, and it was a similar thing. And I think Bob and I had the same perspective of at first just kind of filling holes in your own collection. Like, this needs to be on vinyl, or this deserves to be heard. Like, because in a lot of cases we find things that are, have never been heard before, and are making that kind of leap of faith. Like, is this good enough? Does this have enough demand? Or if there's no demand, do we think there's a story good enough that it will create some demand? There's a lot of judgment calls, but basically, it's just a weird, constant searching for music that oddly doesn't feel like work, to be honest, because it's like the stuff I find I feel like I find just by existing in the world I've kind of chosen to live in or put around me. So, and I like to say I'm the kind of person that just, be checking out at the grocery store and turn around and, hey, was your uncle in a band and did he leave you a closet full of old reel-to-reel tapes? And if so, can we go through them? It's like practically like that where, so many people were in bands and there's a lot of fascinating things that it's amazing how many people are connected to interesting musicians and things. But yeah, we license from direct to artist mostly, in some cases from other companies, some cases we buy catalogs, quite a few different ways it all comes about. But then over time, Sundazed started initially as very 60s centric with a real focus on garage rock, surf rock, and psychedelic rock. And then over time, it's sort of blossomed into a lot of different things. Like, one of our newer imprints, which in reality, it's still just us. We've just put a different logo on it because we feel like it needs a different branding because it might appeal to a different type of listener. We created an imprint called Modern Harmonic, and the records we decided to speak about today, all fall on that imprint, which tends to be kind of the more esoteric stuff, the more, I want to say more interesting, but by that I just mean kind of more oddball, more out there kind of stuff.
For you personally, because you mentioned it doesn't feel like work, does the music you work with overlap a ton with the music you listen to when you're doing the dishes, walking the dog, what have you?
Yeah, quite a bit. Yeah, they're one and the same. It's to the point where it gets a little odd where like maybe I'll stumble upon something archival and it'll be new to me and I'll just fall in love with it and I'll do a quick search to see what's out there and I'll find out that like Light in the Attic or Numero Group, like two of our competitors who do reissues as well, will be like, just as an example, them like, oh, they already released it. And it's like this almost frustration, like, oh, I was so excited about it and I'd love to be a part of that. But at the same time, very happy that it came out. But yeah, I'm a runner and half the time when I'm running, I'm listening to, stuff that is, technically work, but it's because I enjoy it. Yeah, I'll be up at midnight just going through old eBay listings, looking at old tapes and wondering what's on them and periodically purchasing something just to find out what it is, or it's certainly a life thing. The way to put it in a different perspective too, I do some community radio both here in town and did some in Nashville as well. And in Nashville, that station wouldn't allow me to play any music that was Sundazed. It hit me. I didn't realize how hard that was going to be because if I want to play something on my show, it's because I like it. And if we want to put something out, it's also because I like it. And so it ended up realistically being like I'd play something on the show while I'm trying to track down the artist or trying to track down the estate or trying to, because that's another interesting thing I think you'd find interesting is that, when we're not hunting down tapes or, listening to tapes or whatever, I actually spend a lot of time reading obituaries and things. I'll be like, oh, well, this artist passed, I now have these tapes in my possession, can I find, their spouse? Can I find their children? Who can I find that we can legitimize these releases? How do we put this out and then have money going into the pockets of the families or the rights holders as well? Fascinating how helpful obituaries are, oddly, just because it's the one place where you get sort of a quick glance at someone's family tree when they come out,
Both of those are both the things you ended on, like the fact that you couldn't play Sundays at your old community station. And then the fact that like obituaries, which typically or stereotypically, I guess, a habit of an older person. But if it's useful in connecting the dots to get the music out there and connecting the dots, for the background of the music, I think that's great.
It's a fascinating thing, like where permissions come into. One of the most fascinating and most lucrative parts of the music business nowadays, unless you're, Beyonce or what have you, is sync licensing. The real money is if you can get, if you can do a Kate Bush and get, have your song placed in a hit television show or in a commercial or film. And understandably so, both sides of the music have to agree to license a thing. And when I say both sides, it's not always the same person who controls the rights to the master recording, which would just, really be like that performance, what exactly is on that tape. And then somebody else often controls the publishing. So like, if you and I recorded a version of a Billie Eilish song, we would still own that recording, but any money made from the publishing would go to Billie Eilish or whoever owns the publishing for her song. So when it comes to doing sync licensing, like we literally got a call yesterday from a advertising agency wanting to use one of our songs in a Toyota commercial. And when you hear that, it's exciting because that's like some of the biggest dollar signs we'll ever see individually is like one check, is something like that. And we only control the recording. We purchased the catalog of music from this gentleman who's since passed, and he kept the rights to the publishing. And so now we're in this mad dash trying to find his estate just so somebody can sign off. We're basically just like hunting so that we can find somebody to say, hey, will you accept this massive check from Toyota? It's just strange. But if we don't find them, no one gets a check from Toyota. So it's this really weird like game.
And you're preaching to the choir. I did not share my background, but my dream coming out of high school was to be a music supervisor. I did a few small projects for friends when I got to LA. I worked at a music library, part of Universal. So it's a fascinating world. And in the last few days, I've seen a couple articles about how artists are selling their catalogs now, which is usually like, Aretha Franklin's will was just, or her estate was just settled in the last week or so. But a lot of people are selling their catalogs now, kind of not in the prime of their career, but pretty close to it. So there isn't like a chase to see who can get the check. Like their family has the money today, and then the label, the publisher can deal with all that and make that money in the future. But it's an interesting world. I hope somebody gets that check. If not, I will see if I'm related to this man. I'll do a 23andMe test or something. So let's pivot to, for adult listeners only, the second story and the second album we wanted to talk about came out in the 60s.
Yeah.
Groundbreaking in a sense, in that it was a man singing love songs, romantic songs about another man, and not in the subtle ways that artists might come out today. But all the artists involved kept their identity a secret and identified as straight. What more can you tell me about this album and how you came to it?
Well, it's a very strange one too, and it was one of those that we had acquired a catalog of a label called Edison International, and just once I started getting big reel-to-reel tape machines in my office and access to start really digging into these things personally, at some point, you've gone through all the stuff that and you're just like, well, what is that thing? And you just start playing things. And yeah, the first time I heard it, my jaw dropped. Came out in 1962. And it's fascinating that it was, sort of plastered all over the record for adult listeners only. As well, there was a lot of, I guess, weird things with this. For one, it was, it ended up being, we started doing the research into it and discovered that it was, boy, where to begin here? It was the first record released on Edison International, but the labels sort of got cold feet when they realized sort of the backlash that they could have in 1962 of starting a label with a gay themed record. So they created a fake label called Lace Records and put it on, and the whole record just reads like this. To hear it is just this wonderful, beautiful, just a great record of love songs that happens to be, by men, for men. But to look at it, you would think it was like some really racy, X-rated, kind of record. But at the same time, it like playing away from it because it says, love is a drag. And then on the back, it has sort of a almost definition of drag. It has the little asterisk by drag and says, in music vernacular, a bore, a headache. And like, trying to say like, oh no, we're not saying like drag, like someone would dress in drag, they're trying to like dance around it. Like we didn't initially know the story of it. And we stumbled upon this website by this gentleman, J.D. Doyle, who ran a show called Queer Music Heritage. And he used to play a lot of songs from the album on his show, and he too didn't know much about it. And then he ended up getting a call from one of the contributors to the album, who ultimately sort of told him the history of it. And at that time, which was 2012, for this record that came out in 1962, it wasn't until then that people found out who the artists were and what the background was. And if you've gone into a thrift store and seen a bunch of old records with very pretty women on the cover that are not the singer, like if it's just some random model on the cover, there's a very good chance that if you flip that record over, it'll have a photography credit of Garrett Howard. There was a photography company called Garrett Howard, and it was a partnership between a gentleman by the name of Murray Garrett and a guy by the name of Gene Howard. Murray Garrett was the only gay person involved in the project in any way. And basically he came up with the idea, and as it was told to us and told, I guess, on the radio to JD, was that that they were talking about ideas for their new label, and Murray had told the head of the label that at one point while traveling, he stumbled upon a drag bar, and it was this new thing to him, and it blew his mind, and he felt, it was the most comfortable he'd ever felt, and, felt like he was with, people he could relate to, and it was music he could relate to, and just basically was really passionate about it, and sold the idea to him. And, they pulled it all together. They hired session musicians who were all straight. They hired Gene Howard, who is the other part of that photography company, who was also like a big band singer and did some like Broadway style kind of things. He was like the old big band, like Glenn Miller kind of things. When the band leader was the headliner, he was often, the male voice singing, kind of one of those things. But, and he actually had a fairly marketable name. But yeah, so the album came out with a fake label. Came out, like I said, Lace Records, didn't list any of the musicians, didn't list Gene Howard as the vocalist. The closest thing it says is sultry stylings by a most unusual vocalist. which is sort of funny because there's really nothing unusual about the voice. It's a very nice voice, but it's just a nice, simple voice. I mean, that's what's, I think, fascinating about it. Like, it's been referred to as the first non-exploitative gay-themed record because it wasn't doing, pushing a kitsch sort of vibe or trying to play up flamboyancy in some way or doing some sort of caricature. But at the same time, it's weird that they, went to such efforts to keep it all a secret. But yeah, when Murray Garrett was on the air telling him, he told JD that, it was Gene Howard who did this, and basically that none of the musicians or Gene wanted to shame their families. They didn't want it to be public that they were involved in this controversial record, which is just fascinating. So really, it was until, in 2012 when all of them had passed that secret got unveiled. And oddly, it's there was, if I can pivot to a side record really quick, Edison International had another odd little secret with one of theirs, which was another record we acquired in that catalog that's actually a similar vibe. It's a vocal jazz record of standards by a woman by the name of Claudia Thompson. That was one they put out around the same time, or actually it might have even been earlier. It was either late 50s or early 60s. And there's a woman on the cover, and we always just assumed that was her because it kind of, we kind of felt there was no reason not to. It sounded like it was probably her. And generally, you're not going to see a different woman on the cover of a woman's record. You might see a woman on a man's record or something, or, we had no idea it would be anyone different. It turned out years later, and this was also like within the last 10 years, that this woman found in a thrift shop old film negatives. And there was this little thing going around on the news, like, who is the mystery woman in these photos? And the mystery woman in the photos turned out to be the woman on the cover of the Claudia Thompson record. But then all of a sudden, there's this other woman in the photos too, who is a black woman. The woman on the cover was a white woman. And over time, they sort of pieced it together that basically the Claudia Thompson record was sort of whitewashed. I'm assuming, and I'm embarrassed to say that they basically, I'm guessing, were trying to hit a broader market and thought they could do better with a white woman on the cover, and were trying to pass off that it was a white vocalist, which kind of blew our minds. So that was one of our, another one of our sort of not updating the past, but kind of uncovering the past, I guess you could say, is one of the prouder moments of what I've done with Sundazed was getting those original photos and finally going back and putting Claudia herself on the album cover of that album, 50 plus years later. Unfortunately, she wasn't around anymore to experience that, but we still felt pretty proud, being able to do that. But yeah, there was, with Edison International, I kind of wouldn't be surprised if another just weird mystery pops up with one of their records one day. It's just strange.
Jay, I feel like you should have your own podcast talking about these things. Like, there's so many stories. You presented me with so many options when I reached out. It's like, the music industry is weird. The music industry was very weird. We saw that up until the woman who's saying It's Raining Men. Was it Two Weather Girls?
Yeah.
Like, they kind of changed their image to be more broadly appealing.
Was it Snap too, or whoever did I've Got the Power, I think, or that was, I think, maybe the one. I think I forget, there was one, where they had very pretty model-esque women that they were passing off as basically did a Milli Vanilli. And,
right. So it's not like we've stopped doing that recently, and who knows what's going on now. But whatever ghostwriting's happening, whatever. But I stick beside it. I think your team deep diving into like these mysteries you're uncovering just from, reel to reel tapes from film negatives at estate sales or whatever would be endlessly fascinating. The discovery process, even like building the relationships with the families, which you've discussed, it seems like true crime, but not crime. So it would make me feel less icky for sure, and probably be easier to fall asleep if you're a person that like chooses to fall asleep to true crime.
What's funny, without going all into another story, there's one family we licensed something from, and in giving us permission to put out the record and kind of giving us her story for the liner notes and such, she had told me in passing that she had turned down huge amounts of money from true crime producers who wanted to do her family's story, but she, didn't want her dirty laundry kind of aired out there, but was cool enough to have it in the record liner notes. But yeah, there's a lot of strange stories. I mean, we've discovered that we had a murderer on our roster. We had no idea, just sort of Googling something and having to disclose that. It was the artist, John and Robin, and we licensed a cut to, going back on sync licensing, we licensed a cut for the show Sex Education, which is a show I like. And we had to tell them, like, yeah, we've got that. We can get it to you. You do know he killed someone, right? Like, because we didn't want to just, surprise them with that. But yeah, there's a lot of stories.
Can we jump to liner notes really quickly? Kind of, I don't want to say lost art, but I miss like the tangible physical experience of like thumbing through and like hearing something. I'm like, oh, this sounds familiar. I wonder who the producer is. Or, oh, this sounds familiar. I wonder who this, who maybe the lead writer is. Because I pick up my phone to go look, and then I end up on Instagram or on TikTok or, texting someone. What's the process like developing the liner notes and getting the story down to fit into the album? Because you mentioned we were talking about Love is a Drag, like there's more to it than even the notes could contain. So could you speak more about the process of putting those together and making the hard edits to get it to fit?
It's really tough, and always, there's a lot of times that we don't know the typical thing of you don't know what you don't know. So there are times when we're like, even with the Claudia Thompson we were talking about, we were unable to locate her, but then not long after we reissued the album with the corrected cover and the story, of course, fandom were able to track down and find out a little bit more about her. So it was one of those like, oh, I wish we had that information and, would have made our story a little better. But we, it's a really tough thing because we have some people we go to, like there's a gentleman by the name of Jim Allen, who's one of my favorite liner note writers right now, because I can point him in the right direction, introduce him to the people, and he's really like a investigative journalist who also just has a very fun writing style. Like I like a playful writer. I like somebody who's going to keep my interest and have some, fun, interesting turns of phrase and things. And he does that, but he digs out so much of the stuff because there's so many things that, we end up, like a common day for me would be, stumbling upon some music, going through an obituary to see if I can find the artist or the estate, discovering that I can get the music, and then trying to piece together that past, and like I'll be on the phone maybe with somebody saying, half the time it's like, no, seriously, your dad recorded this when he was in his 20s. Like, you just trust me. That's, so at that point, you're very limited on some of those things. Like, there are some things we put out where we're like, yeah, we know that was the singer, but we can't find documentation anywhere to know who was playing guitar on that and who was, there's a lot of just sort of mysteries that are out there. And then, sometimes we choose wrongly with liner note writers. There's a lot of times where you find this person that on the surface, because they're so connected to the project, it's like, oh, well, yeah, of course, the singer, if they want to write the liner notes, let them write the liner notes. And then you read them and it's like, okay, well, they're great singers, but not the greatest writer. But yeah, it's a real process, and we're constantly searching for them. And it's fascinating too, because we try to be what I'll call culturally responsible too, where, in situations like with Love is a Drag, we were, lucky that, J.D. Doyle was involved in the project and was willing to write for it. And like, we try to find somebody with a close perspective on things. Like, we released an album from a band called Feminine Complex, which was an early 60s all-female band. And, we, not necessarily by choice, but just most of our writers are male. I honestly hunt for more female writers and try and, lull some in. And we did find someone to write for that, and she's written for us since as well. But it's just weird, that like hunting process. I don't know. Yeah, it's a task, and sometimes you get them right, sometimes you get them wrong. And even when you get them wrong, you usually just sort of live with it because you don't want to insult the writer, or and everything is subjective. So somebody else might love the liner notes, sort of a wavy answered question. Sorry, I'm all over the map on that one.
No, I mean, I asked a pretty broad question, so it makes sense. It's an interesting experience that I think the average listener doesn't think about as much, because we don't look at them or evaluate or consider them as much. Like, when we're listening to music, when we're thinking about the music, exploring the music, a lot of stuff is a Google search away, and like, we stick there. But I think it is important. I think it is fun. You can win a Grammy for it. So I definitely think it is important. Jay, that is the end of my questioning on the music and albums we talked about before the conversation. What else do you think people need to know about music, about Sundazed, upcoming releases, your radio show before we wrap up?
Yeah, I mean, our information about what we have coming is always available at sundazed.com. It's like dazed and confused, DAZED, Sundazed. But yeah, we've always got so much coming, and I'm always so scattered with things that it's one of those, like when somebody says, what are you watching these days? Or what are you listening to these days? Where I just can't come up with stuff on the spot because there's always just too much going on. But yeah, we've got a lot coming, and I think, yeah, the liner notes are important. And if we're putting it out, there's a very good chance there's a very good story that comes along with it. It's just tough fighting for that space. Like the Love is a Drag record, as an example, is available now. The Jessica Williams record will be available soon, and we haven't officially announced that one yet. Probably will have when this airs. But it'll be, it's going to be a real battle to try. And even though we think it's a fascinating story, it'll be interesting to see how many publications, bloggers, etc. agree. There's some of those things that we think are the most fascinating stories ever, and we can't get anyone else to repeat the story, so it just kind of dies.
I'll do my part. I'll be telling everybody about
We
this.
appreciate that you do.
I'm excited. And if you ever find anything else and you want to come back, let me know. I did have one other question. Let's say I go to my parents' attic and I find just a treasure trove of music. Do you just like accept unsolicited kind of music to consider?
Kind of, sort of. As long as I got a good hunch to go with it, because I'll usually ask some questions about it and see if I can find out, because, admittedly, a lot of the tapes sitting in someone's attic are letters home from the war. They used to do recorded diaries. You could hear your son or daughter's voice speaking to you from the war. And there's a lot that were just people, recording things off the radio, or, the earliest mixtapes were reel-to-reel tapes, and people were, they saw it as the advantage since they didn't have to get up and flip the record and they could fit more on there. So there's a lot that are just those things. But yeah, if somebody gets a hint that that there's unique recordings on there, that it's a band, that, your family member was in a band and this is them, or they were the tour manager for so-and-so and they've got all these tapes. Basically, if something gives us the hunch that those tapes could be interesting, we'll certainly transfer them for free, just for the fun and privilege of finding out what's on them.
Exciting. But Jay, that's it. Everybody, like Jay said, check out Sundazed.com, see what they have coming out. Go to a record store, go pick something up. I know a lot of people purchase record players. Quality varies, but I know a lot of people have purchased record players in the last few years. So go ahead and put those on, handle it carefully when you flip. Jay, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you.